Robert had spent most of his life in the small cabin nestled on the edge of a quiet forest. It wasn't just a house to him, it was where he had built a life with the love of his life, Marie. The wooden beams of the cabin had witnessed their laughter, their arguments, their growing old together. But now, after Marie's passing, the cabin was all he had left. At 78, Robert didn't have many visitors anymore. His children had their own lives, busy with work and families, and his wife's death had left him with only the memories of a life once full of warmth. His daily routine revolved around the fire in the hearth, the thick curtains drawn to keep out the cold, and long afternoons sitting on the porch, staring at the mountains in the distance. Then, one chilly afternoon, everything changed. He had gone into town to pick up some supplies when he met Caroline. She was sitting on a bench outside the general store, bundled up in a threadbare coat, clutching a battered cardboard sign that read, "Hungry and Homeless." Robert, his heart heavy with years of loneliness, had stopped. He offered her some lunch and the two began talking. Caroline was younger than him, maybe in her late 30s, but there was an undeniable kindness in her eyes that reminded him of Marie. She told him of the struggles she faced, no family, no place to go, just the streets and endless rejection. Her story hit something deep inside Robert. He couldn't imagine someone being cast aside so easily. The days that followed brought more visits from Caroline. She'd show up for tea, and they'd talk for hours. Robert found himself looking forward to her company. She listened to his stories, and with her, he didn't feel like the old man who had no one. She made him feel alive again, reminded him of how much love he still had to give. In a world that had forgotten him, Caroline brought a spark of hope. And then, one evening, as the fire crackled in the hearth, Robert made a decision. He had always thought the cabin would go to his children, his legacy passed down to the next generation. But the more he thought about it, the more it felt wrong. His children hadn't visited in months. They had their own lives, their own families. They'd never truly understood what the cabin meant to him, to Marie. But Caroline? Caroline had brought life back into these walls. She had no one, no family to call her own, and yet, she'd shown him something his children never had, the value of love, compassion, and care. She was the one who deserved the cabin, more than anyone else. With a heavy heart but a clear mind, Robert drew up a new will. The cabin, everything he had left of his memories and love, would go to Caroline. He didn't know how he'd say it to his children. He knew they wouldn't understand. They would be furious, even spiteful. But he couldn't bring himself to leave Caroline to fend for herself. She was the only person who had shown him kindness in years. The day the will was finalized, Robert felt a weight lift off his chest. But little did he know, that single act of kindness would tear apart the fragile family he had left. It wasn't long after his death that the storm hit. His children, upon reading the will, were furious. How could their father, a man who had built a life for them, leave everything to a stranger? A woman they barely knew? The cabin, their inheritance, was supposed to stay in the family. They made their feelings known immediately. They came to the cabin, demanding explanations, their voices sharp and accusatory. Robert's eldest son, Matt, stormed in, red-faced and livid. "This is ridiculous. This place is ours, it always has been. He's gone mad, hasn't he? Leaving everything to some beggar?" Matt's voice was full of venom. Caroline, who had been sitting quietly on the porch, watching the scene unfold, felt her chest tighten. She had never imagined it would come to this. She was prepared for the shock, but not for the anger, the hatred. "Robert must have been confused in his last days," said his daughter, Sarah, her voice dripping with disgust. This isn't right. You don't even know him like we do. This was his home. It should have been ours." Caroline stood up slowly, her legs shaky, and stepped forward. "Robert knew exactly what he was doing," she said quietly, but firmly. "He wanted me to have it. Because I cared for him. I listened to him. I was there when no one else was." The children exchanged looks, their anger now tinged with disbelief. "So, you think you just walk in here, claim this place as yours?" Matt sneered. "You'll have to fight for it, you know. We'll take you to court." Caroline didn't flinch. She had nothing left to lose. "Do what you must," she said, her voice steady. "But Robert's wishes will stand. I'm not going anywhere." As the children stormed out, threatening legal action, Caroline felt a strange mix of sadness and determination. She had never expected things to turn out like this, but Robert's wish was clear. The cabin was hers now, and she would fight for it, not just for herself, but for Robert's memory. The storm was only beginning, and Caroline knew it wouldn't be easy. But she wasn't backing down. Not now. Not after everything Robert had given her. This cabin would be a symbol of love, not greed. She would turn it into a home once again, just as Robert had dreamed. The first day in court felt like a blur to Caroline. Her hands trembled as she sat in the sterile, impersonal courtroom, surrounded by the hustle of lawyers and the cold stare of Robert's children. Matt and Sarah were seated across from her, their faces painted with anger and disbelief. The tension in the room was palpable, the weight of unspoken words hanging between them all. Caroline had never imagined herself in a place like this. She was just a woman who had once been homeless, a woman who had found an unlikely friend in Robert. But now, she was fighting for what she believed was rightfully hers, the cabin that Robert had given her. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs as the judge entered, his gavel ringing sharply against the silence. Caroline took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. Her lawyer, a soft-spoken woman named Claire, whispered a few reassuring words before standing to address the court. Matt's lawyer, a slick and confident man named Robert King, a cruel twist of fate, Caroline thought, stood up first. He pointed a finger at Caroline, accusing her of taking advantage of Robert's kindness in his last days. "My clients believe that Robert was not in his right mind when he made this decision," he declared, his voice booming. "This woman, this stranger, came into his life when he was at his weakest. He was confused, vulnerable, and her presence clouded his judgment." Caroline's heart pounded in her chest as she listened. She knew they would try to paint her as nothing more than a gold digger, someone who had taken advantage of an elderly man. She had expected it, but hearing it spoken so coldly still stung. But she wasn't about to let them win. Robert's memory, his legacy, meant more to her than anything. She stood up slowly, the room growing silent as all eyes turned to her. "My name is Caroline," she began, her voice shaky at first, but growing stronger with each word. "And I didn't come here to take anything from anyone. I came here because Robert was my friend. He was the only person who showed me kindness when the world had turned its back on me. He gave me a chance when no one else would. This cabin, this place, isn't just property to me. It's a symbol of his love, his trust, and his belief in me." She paused, locking eyes with Matt and Sarah, who were glaring at her with hostility. "Robert gave me this cabin because he believed I would honor it. He didn't give it to me because I was trying to take advantage of him. He gave it to me because, in his heart, he knew I was the one who would care for it, the one who would make it a home again." There was a moment of silence. The judge's eyes were on her, his expression unreadable. She knew she wasn't winning anyone over yet, but she wasn't going to back down. This wasn't just a battle for a cabin, this was a battle for what Robert had truly wanted. Matt's lawyer stood up, cutting through the silence. "Your Honor, we believe there are significant questions about the validity of this will. The conditions under which it was signed are questionable. We demand a full investigation into the circumstances surrounding Mr. Robert's last days." The judge nodded. "We will adjourn today and reconvene next week. I want to see further evidence regarding the conditions under which the will was signed." The gavel struck once more, and the room emptied out with the sharp sound of footsteps. Caroline was left alone with her thoughts. She had made her case, but she knew the battle was far from over. As she stepped out of the courthouse, Claire caught up with her. "You did well in there," she said quietly. "But this won't be easy. They've got money and influence. We'll need to dig deeper into the will's creation, Robert's mental state, everything." Caroline nodded, her mind racing. She was exhausted, physically and emotionally, but she couldn't let the weight of it all crush her. She couldn't let them take Robert's legacy away. That night, as Caroline stood outside the cabin, staring at the silhouette of the trees against the darkening sky, she felt a deep sense of purpose. This place had become more than just a house to her. It was a home, a place of warmth, a reminder of the love Robert had given her when no one else did. She wasn't going to let them take it. The next few days were a blur of phone calls, legal documents, and long nights filled with stress. Caroline didn't have much, just the few belongings she had carried with her when she had first arrived at Robert's cabin. But she was determined to fight with everything she had. One evening, as she sat in the living room of the cabin, reading through the papers her lawyer had given her, there was a knock on the door. Caroline's heart skipped a beat. She wasn't expecting anyone. She opened the door to find Sarah standing there, her expression softer than Caroline had ever seen it. "I don't know why I'm here," Sarah said quietly, her voice laced with uncertainty. "Maybe because I know I should have been a better daughter. I should have spent more time with him. I should have cared more." Caroline stepped aside, letting Sarah in. They sat down together on the couch, the weight of unspoken words heavy between them. "I didn't know you," Sarah continued, looking down at her hands. "But I know my father. He wasn't the type to make decisions like this lightly. If he gave you the cabin, it was because he truly cared about you. He saw something in you that we didn't." Caroline was silent for a moment. She hadn't expected this, especially from Sarah, who had been so angry just days before. "I don't know what will happen," Sarah whispered, her voice filled with emotion. "But if you really care about this place, about what it meant to him, then maybe you're the right person for it after all." Caroline didn't have the words to respond. Instead, she reached out and squeezed Sarah's hand. Maybe, just maybe, there was hope for them after all. But the fight was far from over. There were more legal battles ahead, more pain to face, but for the first time in weeks, Caroline felt a small glimmer of peace. She was doing the right thing. And she wasn't alone. The courtroom was packed, the tension unbearable. Caroline stood once more before the judge, her heart racing as she saw Robert's children seated across from her. The weeks leading up to this moment had been a whirlwind of legal jargon, heartache, and sleepless nights. Caroline had fought tooth and nail to keep Robert's legacy alive, but today was the day everything would be decided. She could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on her shoulders. There was no turning back now. Matt's lawyer, Robert King, began the proceedings with his usual arrogance. "Your Honor," he said, his voice dripping with condescension, "the defense has shown clear evidence that Mr. Roberts' mental state was deteriorating when the will was made. He was under undue influence, manipulated by the defendant." Caroline's fists clenched at her sides. She had heard these accusations 100 times, but it didn't make them any easier to bear. They were trying to paint her as a villain, someone who had used her friendship with Robert to exploit him. But the truth was far from that. Her lawyer, Claire, stood up, her presence calm but firm. "Your Honor, we've presented evidence that Robert was in full possession of his faculties when the will was signed. He had clear, undisturbed contact with Caroline throughout his final days. His decision was made freely, without coercion." The courtroom went quiet as Claire continued, presenting witness statements, medical records, and even letters from Robert himself, expressing his gratitude for Caroline's companionship and support. Caroline's heart swelled with pride, but she knew it wasn't over yet. Then it was Caroline's turn to speak. She stood, her legs shaky, but her resolve unshakable. "Your Honor, I'm not here to take something that doesn't belong to me. I'm here because Robert saw something in me. He gave me this cabin not because I asked for it, but because he trusted me, because I cared for him when no one else did." Her voice wavered slightly, but she pressed on, her words steady and filled with conviction. "Robert didn't have much left when he found me. He had lost his wife, his friends, and his family had moved on with their own lives. I was the one who was there, the one who sat with him, listened to him, and helped him in ways his family never did. This cabin is more than just property to me. It's a symbol of his kindness, his love, and the bond we shared. And I won't let them take it from me." She could see Matt's expression falter for a moment, and she knew that what she was saying was resonating. She wasn't just fighting for a piece of land, she was fighting for a relationship, for a friendship that had been misunderstood and dismissed. But then, as expected, Robert King stood up, cutting through her moment of vulnerability. "Your Honor," he said, "we believe the defendant is emotionally attached to the property, which is clouding her judgment. She's not considering what's best for Mr. Roberts' legacy. We, his children, are his blood. We are the ones who will honor his name, not this outsider." Matt stood, his face contorted with anger. "This is our father's legacy. You have no right to it. You never even knew him like we did." The words hit Caroline like a punch in the gut. She had known that Matt and Sarah felt betrayed, but hearing it so plainly, with so much venom, made her blood run cold. But she didn't flinch. She couldn't. "You don't know what he went through in his final years," Caroline said, her voice rising, fueled by years of pent-up frustration. "You didn't see him, alone, in that cabin, with no one to talk to but me. He wasn't asking for your money, your approval, or your inheritance. He was asking for someone to see him, to care for him in his last days. I gave him that. And he gave me this place as a gift, because that's what he wanted." The room was silent for a moment, the gravity of her words sinking in. Even the judge seemed to pause, taking in what Caroline had just said. But then Robert King spoke again, his voice cold. "The law is the law, and the law says that Robert's children have the right to inherit his property. We will not allow an outsider to take it from us." The gavel came down hard, and the judge's voice broke through the tension. "We will deliberate and reconvene tomorrow for the final ruling. Court is adjourned." Caroline felt her heart sink. She had fought so hard, but the battle wasn't over yet. As the courtroom emptied, she stood still, lost in her thoughts. Matt and Sarah glared at her as they passed, their eyes filled with contempt. Claire placed a hand on her shoulder, offering a silent gesture of support. Caroline felt the sting of their judgment, but she couldn't let it break her. She had done everything she could. She had shown the court who she was, what Robert had meant to her. Now, all she could do was wait. The next day felt like an eternity. The courtroom was quiet, the air thick with anticipation. The judge entered, his expression unreadable. Caroline held her breath, her palms sweating. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her, the silence in the room louder than any words. The judge's voice rang out. After considering all the evidence, I have reached a decision. Caroline's heart skipped a beat. This was it. The will of Mr. Robert, as it stands, will be upheld. The cabin will be passed to Caroline, as per his wishes. A wave of shock and relief washed over Caroline. She had won. It wasn't just the cabin that mattered anymore, it was the fact that Robert's wishes had been respected, that his love for her had been honored. Matt and Sarah sat in stunned silence, their faces pale with disbelief. Caroline could hardly believe it herself. She had done it. She had won. As she walked out of the courtroom, Claire beside her, she finally allowed herself to breathe, to let go of the tension that had been suffocating her for so long. It wasn't just the cabin that mattered, it was everything Robert had given her. And she was going to make sure that his legacy, his spirit of kindness and generosity, lived on. The battle had been hard, but in the end, Caroline had triumphed. And the cabin, once just a place, was now a home, a symbol of love, friendship, and the power of doing what's right. As Caroline stood outside the courthouse, looking up at the clear blue sky, she felt a sense of peace settle over her. She had won, not just for herself, but for Robert. And that was all that mattered. Weeks passed since the ruling, and Caroline stood before the cabin, the place that had become a symbol of everything she had fought for. The fight in the courtroom had been long, draining, and sometimes felt hopeless, but now it was over. Robert's cabin was hers, just as he had wished. The weather was warm that day, the golden sunlight casting long shadows across the worn wooden porch. Caroline ran her hand across the railing, feeling the smooth texture, the years of love and care embedded in every corner of the home. This was more than just a property, it was Robert's memory, his kindness, his belief in her when no one else did. With a sigh, she opened the door, stepping into the cozy living room, where the familiar scent of old pine mixed with the faint trace of cedarwood. The place felt like home, but it was also so much more. This was a place where hope had been born, a place that held the last chapters of Robert's life and the first of hers. She could hear his voice echoing softly in her mind, telling her to take care of the cabin, to let it live on. Caroline had made promises, to herself, to Robert, and to the spirit of kindness that had defined him. And she was determined to honor them. Over the past few weeks, she had worked tirelessly to restore the cabin, breathing new life into it. Every wall, every piece of furniture, had been cleaned, repaired, and painted with care. It wasn't just a renovation, it was a resurrection. She wanted it to be a place where memories could be made, where others could find the peace and warmth that Robert had given her. But Caroline didn't stop there. She had a vision for the future, one that extended beyond the walls of the cabin. Robert's death had left a void, but his legacy would not fade into the past. The foundation she had started, the one that would support others who had been cast aside by society, was now growing. She wanted to help people, just like she had been helped, people who had nowhere to go, no one to turn to, people like Robert, who had been forgotten by his own family. Word had spread through the small town about her victory, and many who had once dismissed her began to see her differently. She had become more than just the woman who won a court case, she was a beacon of hope, a symbol of resilience. Caroline's first project was already underway. She'd partnered with a local charity to provide housing for homeless women and children, offering them a safe place to rebuild their lives. The cabin would serve as a sanctuary, not just for her, but for others who needed it. It would become a center for support, offering classes, job training, and emotional care. Robert's memory would live on through the kindness and love that flowed from the very place he had once called home. As Caroline walked through the rooms, her heart swelled with emotion. She could almost see Robert there, sitting by the fire, a warm smile on his face, telling her how proud he was. He hadn't left her alone, he had given her the strength to stand up for what was right, to fight for love and loyalty. A knock at the door broke her reverie. Caroline opened it to find a familiar face standing in the doorway. It was Lisa, one of the women Caroline had helped through the foundation. She was smiling, holding a basket of flowers in her hands. "I thought you might like these," Lisa said, her eyes filled with gratitude. "For Robert. And for you." Caroline smiled, taking the flowers, feeling the weight of the moment. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. She looked out at the open field beyond the cabin, feeling a deep sense of peace settle over her. This is just the beginning. Over the next few months, the cabin became a hub of activity. Women came and went, some leaving with new opportunities, others staying a bit longer, finding solace in the quiet, peaceful surroundings. The cabin was no longer just a house, it was a lifeline. And Caroline made sure that everyone who walked through its doors felt welcome, just as she had once felt. But the most profound change wasn't in the cabin itself, it was in the community. Caroline's efforts had sparked something in the people around her. Slowly, the town began to change. Neighbors who had once ignored each other now reached out with kindness. People who had never known the value of compassion started volunteering, contributing to the foundation's work. Caroline's story became more than just her own, it became a story of transformation, of how one act of kindness could ripple out and change an entire town. One afternoon, Caroline stood in the garden, planting new flowers along the edge of the porch. She felt a deep sense of fulfillment as she worked, knowing that she was doing exactly what Robert would have wanted her to do. The wind rustled through the trees, and she could almost hear his voice again, whispering through the branches, telling her how proud he was. The sound of children laughing reached her ears, and she turned to see a group of kids running across the lawn, playing with the stray dogs that had found their way to the cabin. Her heart swelled. This was what Robert had given her, a life filled with purpose, filled with people who mattered. She had done it. She had honored his memory, and in doing so, she had built something far greater than herself. The cabin had started as a place of solitude, a symbol of Robert's final wish. But it had transformed into a home for those who had nowhere else to turn, a home for the forgotten, the lost, and the lonely. And as Caroline watched the children play, her heart full of hope for the future, she realized that Robert's legacy was alive in every person whose life had been touched by his kindness. And that, in the end, was the greatest gift of all. Robert's spirit, and the love they had shared, would live on forever.